Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Azar Dakwar. I'm a doctoral researcher in critical theory and political theology at the University of Kent. I'm really happy to welcome you to this panel, The Ends of Precarity Capitalism, we titled it. It's a virtual author meets critics panel that will address the avenues of critique of contemporary capitalism and radical change it occasions, as raised in Albena Asmanova's recent book, Capitalism on Edge, which came out with Columbia University Press in January this year. Here's the book. This author meets critics panel was supposed to take place in the at the 28th edition of the Philosophy and Social Science Conference, otherwise known as the Critical Theorist Colloquium at Prague in these very days. But we're holding it now. We decided to hold it virtually on our initiative. So the panel will proceed as follows. I'll say some words on the book and about the question it opens up. Then we'll have 4 15-minute contributions or interventions in a row by our panelists, whom I will introduce in a second. And then we will have the author, Albena Asmanova, replying to her critics. And finally, I will be opening up the floor to questions and answers, which you can do through the waving function of the Zoom application, and so on. So with us today or tonight are from London, Professor Paul Apostolidis, from State College, Pennsylvania, Professor Amy Allen, and from Berlin, Professors Leah Ypi and Klaus Offi, and from Brussels, Professor Asmanova. I will say some words on the book, on the subject matter, and then we'll start the panel. So in Capitalism on Edge, Albena Asmanova offers a fresh conceptual toolbox for the radical critique of capitalism and ultimately radical change. Asmanova re-engages critical social theory of Frankfurt School pedigree with a critique of political economy of capitalism. Habitual efforts to critique and resolve the social harm inflicted by democratic capitalism, or the so-called democratic capitalism, emerge mainly within the remit of political institutions or in intimate relation to it, and engage the question of democracy versus authoritarianism as a conceptual strategy for mitigation. In Capitalism on Edge, Asmanova suggests rather to shift the critical gaze to political economy itself. This shift makes Asmanova's prognosis differ from that of scholars and pundits who similarly trace tendencies which could lead to overcoming capitalism and or to utopia of socialism. Asmanova's novel critique of capitalism foregrounds capitalism's pursuit of competitive production of profit rather than focusing on forms of ownership and patterns of wealth distribution. She contends that the all-pervasive dominant modality of capitalism, that is neoliberal capitalism, has mutated into a new form, precarity capitalism, she calls it, which is marked by the emergence of a precarious multitude. Widespread economic insecurity ails the 99% across differences in social class, income, education, and professional occupation. It is the underlying cause of such diverse hardships as work-related stress and chronic unemployment. In response, Asmanova calls for forging a broad alliance of strange bedfellows whose discontent would challenge not only capitalism's unfair outcomes, but also the drive for competition, profit-making, and production at its core, which is sort of encapsulated in the competitive production of profit, competition, profit-making, and production. To achieve this synthesis, progressive forces need to go beyond the old ideological certitude of, on the left, fighting inequality, and on the right, increasing competition. Asmanova deploys a three-dimensional conception of domination: relational, systemic, and structural, to dissect and critique the forms of domination bequeathed by capitalism as a comprehensive system of social relations. This allows her to move the core of the critique of capitalism from issues of class struggle, that is the structural dimension, and distribution, that is relational dimension, to the competitive production of profit, which she terms the systemic dimension. And she qualifies this dimension, the systemic one, as the very operative logic of capital reproduction, and as such, she deems it responsible for generalizing precarity, mere survivability, and fear across society. On this basis, she elaborates a comprehensive program of emancipatory action that targets these three aforementioned dimensions of domination. Asmanova's conceptualization of systemic domination as a matter of subjection of all members of society to the competitive profit-making pressures of capitalism enables an ambitious form of social emancipation that surpasses the familiar concerns with inequality, exclusion, and property relations. According to her analysis, leftist political forces failed to fight for emancipation from systemic domination. Truly radical practices and politics are ones which target the systemic logic of capitalism, the competitive production of profit. Such reorientation in analysis and diagnosis, as Asmanova maintains, helps progressive politics circumvent its paradox of emancipation. That is the situation in which the successful fighting of one form of domination deepens another form. Ultimately, this allows a project of emancipatory transformation to emanate from historicist analysis of systemic decay without maintaining that revolutionary change is within reach. So this is on the book. So our first panelist is Amy Allen. She will be followed by Paul Apostolidis, and then Lea Ypi and Klaus Offe, and Albena will respond to them. So Amy Allen is a critical theorist and liberal arts professor of philosophy and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Penn State University. She is the author of The End of Progress, Decolonizing the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory. And Amy is co-director of the annual Philosophy and Social Science Conference held at the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague that this panel was supposed to be held at. So Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Azar, both for that introduction and for organizing this event. It's really great to see so many people on the Zoom session to discuss this really terrific book. So, I mean, I want to say just a couple of things. As I'm grateful to Azar for having summarized a lot of the arguments, so I'm not gonna do very much of that in my remarks, but I do just want to note that, I mean, I was really struck rereading the book in the last week or so, because I had read it in manuscript form before it was published, just by how incredibly prescient Asmanova's analysis is. I mean, at least viewed from the perspective of the United States, where layoffs resulting from the COVID crisis have spread from the relatively low-paid service and hospitality sector now to higher income jobs in law, healthcare, and administration, pulling back the curtain on the recovery from the global financial crisis of 2008 and revealing the widespread precarity that cuts across class divisions. And I really found this aspect of Albena's analysis of contemporary capitalism as marked by overwhelmingly by widespread precarity to be completely compelling and timely. I mean, the book is also really a joy to read. I think it represents the culmination of years of research by of overarching argument. It's not a collection of essays. It is an organic and internally structured book that combines sophisticated methodological reflection with a cutting edge diagnosis of the times. So it's just a really impressive, I think, fully realized work that represents a much needed voice within critical theory, one that resuscitates the distinctive contribution of political economy for critical theory in a way that's really also very attentive to the realm of policy concerns, but without in any way being biased towards the status quo. So it's a really remarkable achievement. So for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I just very highly recommend it. Now, of course, there are always questions, you know, things to wonder about. And I'm going to play the role of the philosopher in this panel, nitpicking about some of the conceptual distinctions that Albena makes in the book. I mean, I'm sorry, it's what I do. But I do have a cluster of questions that center on her use of the notions of domination, emancipation, and utopia. Mostly about domination, actually, so I'll spend most of my time talking about her account of that, but then a few questions about emancipation and utopia. So let me start with domination. Azar already kind of reviewed for us her typology of domination as a tripartite conception that has relational, structural, and systemic modes. And some of you who've been to Prague will have heard Albena present parts of this analysis there before as well. And I find that account incredibly helpful. And I was also really happy to see it kind of provide a lot of the structure for the book, because it gets introduced early on as a kind of diagnostic typology, and then it comes back at the end of the book as a way of considering how the specific forms of domination under precarity capitalism can be transformed. So I think this is a really, it's in a way one of the conceptual backbones of the book, and it's a really rich account of domination. But I do have a couple of questions about this typology, and specifically about how the different forms of domination relate to each other. And I would really be interested to hear Albena say more about this. So the first question concerns the relationship between relational and structural domination. And I guess as a related matter, it's really maybe more of a question about how structural domination is defined here. So I would think that structural domination counts as domination precisely insofar, or maybe only insofar, as it consists of social structures or institutions that create, reinforce, or maintain relational domination. In other words, that you wouldn't call a structure a kind of form of structural domination unless it was in some way creating or upholding or reinforcing relational domination, meaning relations of domination between specific groups. So for example, the private ownership of means of production, which is one of Albena's examples of structural domination, may not create, but it certainly does reinforce and maintain class domination, pitting the interests of capitalists, namely the interests of accumulating profit, against those of workers, namely interests in higher wages. And I think that's more or less how Marx understands the relationship between structural and relational domination, although of course he doesn't use those two terms. Now, if this is correct, then I think these two forms of domination have to be thought together as mutually reinforcing parts of a larger picture. And sometimes I think this is how Asmanova presents these two forms of domination. But that way of understanding these two types or forms seems at odds with how she actually defines structural domination. And this is from page 53 of the text, where she defines structural domination as concerning, quote, the actor's incapacity to control the institutions through which the constitutive dynamic of the social system is enacted, end quote. And another kind of definition on offer on page 54 is that structural domination through which powerful groups exercise their power. And it seems to me that structural domination is less about either of those things, actually, and more about how certain social structures create the conditions for relational domination, or the conditions within which relations of domination can be exercised. Okay, so then the second question, and in a way, I think this what Albena calls the incapacity to control the institutions through which the constitutive dynamic of the social system is enacted, which she attributes to, or in a way offers as a definition of structural domination, actually has more to do with systemic domination and more to do with something like the classical Frankfurt School analysis of reification or alienation, which is what leads me then to her account of systemic domination. So whereas structural and relational domination refer ultimately, though in different ways, to the power of some groups over others, systemic domination refers to the ways that all are subordinated to the overarching logic of capitalism, namely the competitive production of profit. And so this distinction between systemic domination on the one hand and structural and relational domination together on the other hand, thus has its roots in the distinction between Marx's critiques of alienation and exploitation, as Albena acknowledges in the book. Another precursor that she doesn't discuss is Iris Marion Young's distinction between domination, which is Young's term for what Asmanova calls systemic domination, and oppression, which is for Young primarily structural, and thus need not, but may be manifest in relational forms. Okay, so I see Albaina's account here as kind of and Young in a way that I think is really important and helpful. But here's possibly a difference. Whereas Marx and Young make what seems to me to be a qualitative distinction between these different forms of power, that is, between alienation and exploitation for Marx, or between domination and oppression for Young. Albaina's distinction, I think, is a little bit fuzzier and harder for me to completely get a grip on. Sometimes it seems as if for her, systemic domination is just a deeper form of structure that undergirds the structural and relational forms. So for example, when she says, quote, "We need to focus our attention on the way the very constitutive dynamic of the system is instantiated in structural domination and expressed in relational domination." So there it seems like the systemic is just a kind of deeper form of structure. Relatedly, it isn't actually clear to me that systemic domination in Asmanova's sense actually affects everyone in precarity capitalism, as opposed to simply narrowing the circle of the so-called winners to the 1%, or perhaps the 0.1%, depending on how you define it. That is, to those who have sufficient income from non-employment-based sources to escape the ranks of the precariat. So what is it about the competitive production of profit that harms them exactly, the 1%? Now, one answer here might be, and this is a kind of sub-theme running throughout the whole book, that even the 1% or the 0.1% are harmed by the environmental degradation generated by the systemic logic. So they're not subjected to precarity in terms of their own relationship to the labor market or income, but they are subject to environmental precarity. So no, that by access to clean water, land on higher ground, I don't know, land on the moon or whatever it might be. But it does stretch the use of the term domination here in a way that I think would be interesting to think about. So in other words, I think that in the end, as Asmanova develops her analysis of the specific form that systemic domination takes in precarity capitalism, it becomes a bit less clear how it's a distinct form of domination, distinct from the structural form. Okay, how much time do I have, Azar? Can I say a few things about Emancipation and Utopia? Where did he go? Oh, there you are. Can I go on for like 2 more minutes?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So I'll be more brief about Emancipation and Utopia. So first about Emancipation, I mean, I'm very sympathetic with the method that Albaina puts forward in this book, which I would understand as an attempt to identify possibilities for emancipation in the present negativistically, by first analyzing relations and structures of domination and then considering how they might be practically transformed, rather than, say, sketching a positive account of utopia and defining emancipation in terms of like progress toward that goal. Still, I do have some questions about the details of her account, and the first concerns her discussion of what she calls the paradox of emancipation, which is already first of the ways that attempts to ameliorate relational and structural domination can reinforce, unwittingly, systemic domination by strengthening the logic of the overall system. Now, this seems to me to be a powerful and insightful claim, so much so that her attempt to dispel this paradox in the conclusion to the book strikes me as a bit too easy. So the question of how Albaina could avoid her own paradox started to emerge for me as a reader in chapter 7, when she notes that taxing the rich might be a good place to start, even where earlier she had said, attempts to improve one's position within the system only reinforce the logic of the system and therefore make it stronger, right? So that's the paradox of emancipation. So I was really happy to see her address this question, like how does my, kind of responding to domination on all these different levels or all these different forms avoid the paradox of emancipation? I was really happy to see her address that issue directly in the conclusion on page 194. Still, having reread her closing pages several times, I'm not sure precisely how this paradox gets dissolved. I think the answer is supposed to be that the current stage of capitalism has generated such widespread discontent and unhappiness that the time is ripe for its own overcoming through a passive revolution. But this might assume that systemic domination really does harm everyone. If it doesn't in fact harm the 1% or the 0.1% who are shielded from insecurity and precarity, then aren't we just as likely to be heading towards full-scale oligarchy? That issue aside, conceptually, how does this claim help to address the paradox of emancipation? I mean, won't it still be the case that stabilization of production, employment, and income that Asmanova contends are necessary conditions for political agency and means for redressing relational and structural domination will serve to reinforce the logic of precarity capitalism? Okay, and then a final point about utopia. Again, I'm really sympathetic with Albaina's hesitance about the concept of utopia. I mean, it's in the subtitle of the book that we can achieve radical change without utopia. And I agree with her that we don't need a positive vision of utopia to do critical theory, but I wonder about the status of her rejection of utopia. So does she reject it on normative or conceptual grounds? That is because the concept itself is dangerous, because it rests on the pernicious fiction of a power-free form of life, or because it sanctions the, all manner of evils in its name. Okay, so is it a normative or conceptual claim, or is this an empirical claim? Does she reject the concept of utopia on empirical grounds? It seems like it might be the latter. For example, when she says that the new ideological geography of the West leaves no space for utopia. But then I wonder about the evidence for this claim, because it certainly seems as if those who cluster around what she calls the opportunity pole of the new ideological configuration do refer to some sort of utopian vision, a vision represented by ideas like open borders, cosmopolitanism, technological advancement, networked interconnectedness, the information economy, et cetera. So is it the case that there is really no longer any space for utopia, or has the locus of utopian vision shifted from socialist revolutionaries to the tech titans of Silicon Valley? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Amy, for this very fine philosophical point. So now we'll be listening to Paul Apostolidis' intervention. Paul is a political theorist specializing in integrating empirical field research on migrant workers into political and critical theory. He's an associate professorial lecturer in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is the author of The Fight for Time, Migrant Day Laborers and the Politics of Precarity, just published by Oxford University Press. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Azar. So I'd like to thank everyone who's attending. Hopefully we're bringing in a wider audience than I think would have been the case in Prague. Azar, thank you for coordinating, and especially thanks to you, Albaina, for writing this important and insightful book. Okay, so I'd like to start by acknowledging a couple contributions that I think this book makes in particular, and then ask some questions. And my questions may imply certain criticisms of Albaina's argument, but I offer them mainly in a spirit that sees the book as a point of departure for considering further issues of theory and politics. In his recent review of Capitalism on Edge, James Galbraith reacted with a bit of good-natured eye-rolling to Albaina's second chapter, which is on the concepts and practices of critical theory. I, however, would urge everyone to read this chapter because to my mind, it provides a very clear and compelling synthesis of critical theory's intellectual commitments that I think is drawn impressively from across decades in which these priorities have been very much in dispute. Albaina achieves this synthesis in a way that both validates recent critical theory's engagements with normative political philosophy, and she reasserts the vital importance of the critique of political economy, which was more characteristic of the early Frankfurt School. I agree with her that critical theory has tended to neglect such critique in recent years, and it delights me to see her book taking this stand. I think a particularly key aspect of Albaina's reconstruction of what it means to practice critical theory is her reaffirmation of critical theory's investment in immanent critique. Albaina argues that rather than abstracting from historically shaped social circumstances and seeking to envision ideal visions of justice, a theory in politics of transformation must work from within concrete material conditions and strive to ameliorate existing forms of injustice. And this makes it necessary to grapple with the specific ways that contemporary social groups, she says, identify their grievances and define them as forms of injustice. In turn, Albaina's vision of a political economy of trust presupposes that radical change can only proceed by differently activating political and policy resources that already exist, but the potential of which has gone unrealized. And for Albaina, such resources include national government's capacities to decommodify major areas of the economy and enable voluntary labor market entry and exit through vastly increased social provision. And they also involve the ability of international agreements to alter the contours of globalization by strengthening world standards for employment and compensation. So this brings me to my first question, and this concerns the relation between critical theory and popular discourses. So Albaina argues that capitalist society today is characterized by two fundamental antinomies. One she calls the problem of surplus employability. And this refers to the contradiction between the rising potential for decommodified social life and the steady heightening of intensified, generalized commodification pressures. For Albaina, these pressures are palpably felt in today's growing, digitally enhanced inducements to work without pause and with single-minded compulsivity. And this syndrome entrenches paid employment more than ever as the premier social value, even as the digital revolution creates unprecedented opportunities for generating social wealth with far less labor time. This in turn relates to this, I don't know if you can hear the noise out in the street, but it just started here in London. But you may hear a buzz in the background. I don't think it's Joel Singer again though. So the second antinomy that Albaina theorizes is that of acute job dependency. This, she argues, is the predicament by which the economy produces fewer and fewer jobs, fewer and fewer good jobs, and yet people's reliance on paid employment keeps rising as wages keep stagnating and relentless austerity brings social supports to ever more abysmal levels. And like the first autonomy, the second demonstrates how the condition of precarity is not just concentrated among society's lowest wage and most disposable workers, but rather it infuses the labor economy as a whole. The social policies associated with a political economy of trust are thus universalist in scope, and the accent on state-led decommodification and decreased job dependency responds directly to the two antinomies. So my question is, in what distinctive ways do various groups of workers today seem to be giving voice to these antinomies, which you theorize, Albaina, on the social structural plane? And do we not need to incorporate listening more attentively to these voices, confused and conflicting though they might be, within the process of theorizing social contradictions and their remedies? I mean, we, as critical theorists who favor the methods of immanent critique. Towards the end of chapter 6, Albaina, you suggest that we hear voices responding critically to the two antinomies when Occupy declares the outrage of the 99% and the obscenely wealthy, or when right-wing nationalists rally in West Virginia, and even when corporate executives complain about a badly skewed work-life balance. I think you're right to posit that anti-precarity sentiment can be discerned in virtually every quarter of society because precaritization is a generally encompassing tendency driven not just by relational, but by systemic domination and generalized through structural mechanisms. So I think what you're saying here is plausible and suggestive, but it needs to be substantiated empirically. More specifically, and a more nuanced question, would you agree that the question is not just whether pro-Trump zealots, Google managers, and organized groups of the precaritized alike are expressing frustration with the antinomies you have theorized, but also what languages are these popular groups mobilizing to articulate grievances and to characterize them as injustice? And what can critical theorists learn about the best ways to conceptualize capital's contemporary contradictions if we treat those popular languages as theoretically productive rather than social data? I want to suggest that the move you make from theorizing the two antinomies to calling for a political economy of trust needs to be mediated by considering how working people in diverse social quarters understand their conditions of life and the pathways that they see for improving things. Would you agree that practicing immanent critique should spur critical theory to search among popular discourses, not just for validation of our thought models, but also for vital sources of conceptual innovation? So that's the first compound question. My second question is this. If rekindling the spirit of immanent critique means, at least in part, searching for intellectual sparks in ordinary workers' expressions of grievance and injustice, then where should we focus our explorations? Which groups should we prioritize in analyzing popular opposition to precarity? That is, if we're not satisfied with the easy answer that any group will do, because precarity implicates all social sectors. So Albana and I had an interesting experience recently when we published a short article about precarity and the pandemic in Jacobin. So we stressed how the pandemic has lethally exacerbated the exceptional precarity of certain groups of highly vulnerable workers, like domestic workers or non-medical hospital workers, Deliveroo riders, and the list goes on. Yet we also argued that COVID-19 exposes how precarity envelops the working world as a whole and assaults people on all rungs of the social hierarchy. Now, both in this article and in a similar one that I wrote for Public Seminar, we got real pushback from editors who wanted the message simplified. They wanted us to leave out the counterintuitive second point and just say the coronavirus is ravaging the poorest working class people and intensifying their precarity. In the left public sphere, that is, there appears to be a real resistance to acknowledging the all-encompassing character of precaritization and a stubborn insistence on framing precarity as exclusively the problem of poor working class, especially non-white others. Well, notwithstanding the appalling suffering of low-wage migrant workers, gig workers, and others on the labor economy's nethermost tiers, as well as the historical deafness of academia and mainstream journalism to such people, is there perhaps a particular political need right now for research on precarity among more comfortably situated groups, like mid-level executives, self-employed tech workers, or contingent workers in law and journalism? This might go a ways towards answering a question that you had, Amy, about systemic domination and whether everyone really is vulnerable to it. If this kind of research would be valuable, then how would we carry it out in ways that don't risk homogenizing experiences of precarity by glossing over the distinct circumstances of more obviously vulnerable groups? How could we put research with the relatively well-off in dialogue with research among the most marginalized workers to specify what imminently derived popular terms would most effectively help politicize and maybe also reconceptualize the antinomies of precarity capitalism? I wonder in particular if some reformulated concept of class might be of use in formulating this kind of analysis. The common conception of precarity as located and fixed within the poorest working populations is sometimes accompanied by announcements that a new class war has broken out. The Nation just used this sensationalist declaration to frame its expose of rampant COVID-19 threats in US meatpacking plants and the federal government's use of emergency defense powers to force a largely migrant and Black workforce to stay on the job despite the risks. Beyond the domain of left journalism, just last week, the National Day Labor Organizing Network released a set of popular education guides on COVID-19 and health and safety on the job for people whom these day laborers called not essential workers, but the essential working class. So I'm with you, Albana, in arguing that we need a universalist vision of social politics and policy, precisely because precarity spreads its reach over society in general, rather than only attacking society's most beleaguered groups. But I'm not convinced that simply advancing such a universalist politics of solidarity is enough to win cooperation by the heralds of a new class war. They are missing the suffusion of precarity throughout the economy, but they are intuiting something crucial, which is that there are categorically distinguishable types and levels of social suffering today. Perhaps the best response then would be to embrace a rhetoric of class while theorizing class in a new way that draws attention to class-differentiated permutations of generalized precarity. Or would you argue that in the interest of a more universalist politics that corresponds to the systemic engines and spread of precarity, we are better off de-emphasizing both the rhetoric and the critical theorization of class? So I want to wrap up with just a few comments about the concept of crisis. So I think another valuable contribution of your work, Albana, is your thesis regarding what you term the crisis of capitalism. Right? You also do critical theory a real service by insisting on the need to find a route toward emancipation, as well as the possibility of doing so, notwithstanding capital's endlessly versatile capacities for turning breakdown into new profit potential. This is in sharp contrast, say, to David Harvey, who was brilliant at tracing capital's tactics for temporally deferring and geographically displacing its crisis-generating dysfunctions but less helpful with discerning political paths forward. And likewise, I think you're on the mark when you analyze the paradigm shift in the legitimation deal from the neoliberal model that figured austerity cuts as necessary to heighten efficiencies and essential supports to a new mode for which precarity without end is a given, with state-provided social spending simply not to be expected and irrelevant to state legitimacy, although that may have changed. You argue convincingly, in other words, that neither political legitimation crisis nor capital accumulation crisis of its own can be relied on to generate radical energies sufficient to propel grand-scale social transformation. Accordingly, when you advance your program of action in the book's conclusion, you eschew the temporality of crisis and of rapid response. Instead, the temporality of political action here is in the mode of tempered, reasonable policy analysis and gradual reform that nonetheless has a radical developmental trajectory. So you argue, and I'm quoting from page 193, that reforms for countering social and economic uncertainty would provide the material conditions for reframing, politicizing, protest in more radical and constructive directions, thereby enabling the angry multitude to become a political agent with a positive agenda. And you offer taxing the rich and other efforts to build capitalism with a human face as examples of such reforms. Now, these are my last comments here. On the one hand, I appreciate your eminently critical sensibility. I would add that it's vital to think along similar lines when we look outside the state to civil society and try to envision the kinds of anti-precarity organizing by workers that have real utopian prospects. This is what I have argued, that the growth of worker centers and day labor organizing networks in the United States have been demonstrating for the last 30 years. That's the potential to develop a politics that opposes precarity by extending pathways of radicalization from within and by virtue of precarity's imminent circumstances. On the other hand, it's important not to understate the degree to which subjective experiences of crisis pervade our contemporary precaritized structure of feeling. These experiences take shape within the insecure and incessantly driven world of work that you discuss. They mingle affect and body and time. They feature in part the temporality of oppressive continuity because the compulsion to work, prepare for work, search for work, stay physically safe at work never lets up. But they also exhibit the temporality of crisis, of rupture and discontinuity, whether due to the arrhythmia of gig jobs, digital alerts that jolt users to expend micro units of labor times before falling idle to await the next summons, or traumatic moments when workers' bodies get injured or break out in illness. And so I think this paradoxical ordinariness of crisis, as Lauren Berlant has termed the phenomenon, can be politicized in ways that support broad-scale policies of social solidarity. But that requires finding ways for popular groups to give public expression to the crisis aspect of this temporal figure. And it requires that policy and political programs manifest responsiveness to crisis experience. As US day labor leader Pablo Alvarado put it, organizers, and I would add critical theorists, need to make time and space to, quote, let suffering speak. Well, I don't know if Alvarado has read Adorno, but you might think he had done so because he seems to have his finger on the pulse of imminent critique. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Paul, for this wide-ranging and practical engagement. So next is Leah Yepes' intervention. Leah is a political theorist and professor in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also an adjunct associate professor in philosophy at the Research School of Social Sciences at the Australian National University. She is author, among others, of Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, Oxford University Press. Leah, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thank you very much to Albena for writing this wonderful book, which I really enjoyed reading and from which I learned a lot, and of which I also share the overarching commitment, which is to overcome capitalism. Albena advertises the book as an attempt to overcome capitalism without crisis, without revolution, and without utopia. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is to say that you can't overcome capitalism without any of these things. In fact, I think we need all three of them. I think we need a crisis, we need a revolution, and we need a utopia. I'm not going to say a lot about crisis because I think we're lucky we've got it, and we wouldn't be on Zoom if we didn't have it around us right now. So I'm just going to say something about utopia and revolution and why I think it's important to incorporate both of these into our efforts to overcome capitalism. And some of what I'm going to say actually has a few overlaps with what both Amy and Paul said from different angles. So let me start with the utopia first. What do we mean by utopia? I understand utopia as a kind of ideal of human relations that is necessary to ground our critique of capitalism and of the societies in which capitalism is entrenched, and that also shapes our visions of the society that we want to emerge. Which is not to say, it's the same as the, writing the recipes for the cookshops of the future, as Mark said. But I think it's important to have an account of what it is that makes capitalism wrong from a moral perspective and not just from an empirical perspective. And I wasn't so sure, although I share part of Albena's commitment to immanent critique, I also think that immanent critique needs some kind of transcendental criterion. And in particular, I was struck by her remarks that where we find our immanent critique is by observing specific instances of suffering and oppression, which serve as empirical points of entry into the society that is the object of immanent critique. But I think Albena also acknowledges that these claims don't automatically give us a normative guidance. They don't tell us necessarily not every instance, not every grievance in society, not every injustice is a topic of moral concern. There are some grievances that are more important than others. And Albena says that to get a criterion or to get some orientation into which of these instances are going to be more relevant than others, which are going to be progressive and which are going to be regressive, she says we need to think about which of these produces significant social pathology. I'm a bit concerned that talking about social pathology just pushes the can down the road and doesn't give us an account of why these social pathologies are considered morally problematic pathologies. Insofar as I get an answer from your book, it seems to me to have something to do with the way in which power is exercised and some concern with domination and oppression. But what I would like to know is what you think makes domination wrong. What is it that allows us to distinguish between arbitrary uses of power and authorized or legitimate or justified uses of power, and to distinguish between interferences on freedom, assuming that power has something to do with freedom and with exercise of freedom, what are legitimate or justified infringements of freedom and which ones are unjustified. And I think for that, we need a kind of moral theory, or at least some elements from moral theory. And in fact, I thought I found in your book some hints at this moral theory when you say, for example, that we should be guided by drivers in the formation and distribution of life chances. And so you talk about, for example, inequality of life chances. And I wasn't sure why is it that we should prioritize life chances. And I had a whole range of questions on why is it that life chances are valuable, what makes chances at all an important focus of critique, and why we should prioritize them. So I wanted to have an answer to the question of why should we care about life chances and what makes life valuable. And to me, that requires some kind of normative theory and some grounding on a moral philosophy. I also thought that at one point I detected in your book a commitment to a kind of sufficientarian criterion of justice as opposed to an egalitarian criterion of justice. At some point you talk about Harry Frankfurt and you refer to the idea that we've been worried too much about inequality and that has something to do with the politics of envy, or that we shouldn't worry about why the rich are so rich or so much richer, but we should worry about the poor. And to me, that's commitment to worry more about absolute deprivation as opposed to relative deprivation. Again, I wasn't sure why is it that you thought that this is, I didn't understand what justifies it. Why is it that we should prioritize absolute deprivation versus relative deprivation? Bearing in mind also that some instances of absolute deprivation are due to relative deprivation and that we can't actually distinguish between these two. So for example, there are certain kinds of goods that we usually refer to as positional goods, without the relative enjoyment of which we don't know what it is that is an absolute access. So education is one like that. We can't tell what are minimal levels of education without knowing what the relative value of education is in society. So we don't know what the value, for example, of a master's program is without knowing how many people around us have masters or PhDs. So it seems to me that there were a whole range of normative questions to do with the prioritizing of the kind of metric of justice that you go for, which required some further incursion into the terrain of normative theory, and that I think would also lead to a more substantive account of justice or freedom or domination or however you want to call it, which explains what causes, what grounds alienation, what makes alienation wrong and what makes exploitation wrong. So that's about utopia. And my next question has to do with the revolution and why is it that we need revolution, why I think we can't overcome capitalism without revolution. And for that, I think we need to, first of all, maybe talk about what it is, what do we mean by revolution? When we talk about revolution, what is it that we have in mind? I'm always attracted to Rosa Luxemburg's account of revolution, which is one where she explains that the difference between reform and revolution is not in the way in which we execute certain things, but in what it is that we want to reach, what do we want to achieve. Where she says that the difference between reform and revolution is not whether one is slower or more efficient or more effective, more democratic or less democratic, but has to do with the kind of goal that we commit to, and that has to do with the entrenchment in law of that kind of goal. So one thing that I was struck by in your account and also in your set of positive proposals for what happens when we overcome and how to accelerate the overcoming of capitalism is that these are all policy proposals, but they are not political and they're not seen to be legal. So it seemed to me that there is not much at the intersection of law and politics that shapes and grounds the kinds of particular policy proposals that you give. But that if we were to ground these proposals in law and to try and think about how they change legality, what we would end up with would be actually a revolutionary upheaval of the status quo and of the kinds of legal systems and political configurations that we are familiar with. So as I say, if we think of revolution, not the difference between reform and revolution, not so much as a difference in method, you know, one is violent, the other is peaceful, one is slow, the other is fast, and so on. But if we think about it as a difference in the content of fundamental legal dispositions, the content of constitutions, for example, how we constitutionalize certain principles and so on, it seems to me that the kinds of changes that you're advocating and that we discuss when we discuss about overcoming capitalism, decommodification and so on, actually require a revolution because they require a fundamental upheaval of the legal structures of liberal democracies, the way in which we know them. So I wanted to know, why is it that you're hostile to revolution, understood in this way, if you are hostile to revolution, or you know, how is it that you understand revolution? Why are you so worried about it? So my last set of questions is again in that kind of range and has to do with the particular policies that you suggest, both when you talk about relational measures, when you talk about structural measures, and when you talk about systemic measures. To me, they all seemed great, and but I was, I guess, worried that they're all measures that are in the realm of policy suggestions and that don't seem to take into account the levels of conflict that incorporating even a very minimal part of these proposals would cause in the liberal democracies as we know them. So I wanted to hear more from you, and this goes in the direction of some of the things that Paul was also saying. I wanted to hear more from you on how we should understand agency, transformative agency in the current circumstances to enable us to come closer to the realization and to making these policy proposals feasible. I mean, I don't have any, well, I guess I have some reservations about some of the policy proposals that you suggest. So for example, when at the end, when you talk about structural measures and you say that what we need is greater taxation, I thought, well, we don't need to overcome capitalism to get greater taxation. I mean, that's just not overcoming capitalism, right? Taxing is not about overcoming capitalism. So, and a number of other reforms that you mentioned seem to me to follow on from that, and they seem to be measures that would enable us to tame capitalism, to enter into a different stage of capitalism, to arrive at, to get capitalism with a human face, yet, but I didn't really see how we would actually overcome capitalism with these measures and why we wouldn't actually just entrench it even further. And yeah, so I wanted to hear more on that. And the same applies to your discussion at the very end around the systemic policy proposals, for example, recasting globalization and also recasting domestic policies. both sets of proposals seem to me to be very focused on Europe and kind of advanced liberal democracies. And so I guess we need an account of what happens to marginal peripheral countries if we want to avoid the kind of paternalistic attitude that is, like, you're very familiar with the structural adjustment reforms that the EU goes around championing in Eastern Europe, or enlargement candidates where they tell us, look, what we need is these standards, and once you have standards and you will be good citizens of the European Union, we are all fine with you. It seems to me that there's a very high degree of paternalism that endangers the future relationship and the future association of these countries into this kind of political interaction. So I wanted to know, so I guess I had questions there around, first of all, the sort of too much focus on Western European societies, advanced liberal democracies, and relative neglect of what happens to other parts of the world, like, you know, not just Brazil and China and India, but also just looking at Europe, for example, candidate EU countries and so on. But also, how should we conceive and how should we reconceive politics in these places in order to be able to deal with the high levels of conflicts that will be exacerbated once these policy proposals are taken seriously, because particular interests of ruling elites will be very severely affected by these policy measures. And so how can we mobilize the kind of political will that is necessary in order to turn these policy commitments into a substantive entrenchment in law that is also then solid and stable in time and not vulnerable to electoral fluctuations or changes in the nature of liberal democracy. So how can we actually get from the policy commitment to the kind of constitutional changes that would be required in order to make these gains stable and solid across time? And finally, last question, which of these measures actually overcomes commodification and how? And I will just leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Leah, for your constructive criticism and challenging contestations. The last engagement with Albena's book will be delivered by the one and only Klaus Offe. Klaus is a political sociologist and social theorist. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Sociology at the Hertie School of Governance. He has held the chairs for political science and political sociology at the universities of Bielefeld and Bremen, as well as at the Humboldt University in Berlin. His most recent book in English is Europe Entrapped by Polity Press. Klaus, the floor is yours. Klaus, we are not hearing you. You need to unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself. You are muted. Okay. Albena, you can do it.
Is this better? Is this better?
Now we hear you, yes. Can you please repeat from the beginning?
Okay. So, it was a pleasure to read this book, inspiring optimism, suggestive ideas, daring conclusions, optimistic. And of course, I have, like Leah and Paul, I have a few questions that may undermine this daring approach to ending capitalism, overcoming capitalism without revolution, crisis, and utopia. And I think it is a very good idea to focus on the concept of precarity, and which is over the last 10 years everywhere in the social and political theory, a important point. Emphasizing insecurity, anxiety, fear, and unpredictability of what happens to one's life. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And this basic condition of insecurity is something that is characteristic of neoliberal globalized capitalism, and that is certainly it is not the 99% that suffer from precarity. It is, empirically speaking, a matter that affects categories by age, by gender, by skill, by citizenship, and migratory status. And it is not 99%, but at most 30% that suffer from this. And there's a deep divide in the social structures of advanced capitalist societies. Some suffer from this unprotected condition of absence of fate control, and others are doing fairly well. The political divide is clearly that some are protected and some are not protected. And the non-protected are not in any way necessarily interested in overcoming capitalism. They want protection and the state that does not protect them by guaranteeing well-paid jobs. They invoke a state that protects them by strengthening borders. And populism is a response to precarity as much. Right-wing populism emphasizing the exclusionary function of borders is a response to precarity as much as is a reformist / revolutionary approach. So also competition is that you rightly emphasize as a core characteristic of capitalism, competitive pursuit of profit through domination of capital over labor. That is a valid definition of the beast that we are dealing with. Competition is also something that is a frame, a conceptual frame of reading realities as they are experienced and lived through, and a dominant ideology, if you wish. It is accepted as a it's futile for many people. It is something that performs a very important ideological function, namely invites self-blame. If you do not succeed in competition, there is no one to blame but yourself. And therefore, and this, contemporary social democracy has internalized this, we need to improve the competitive position of people, and those who fail, they cannot be helped. We send them to school, allow them to acquire skills, and so they will win in competition, and the others simply need to be forgotten. That is the whole doctrine of activation, and a very good term that is close to my heart that you use, responsibilization, right? You are responsible for what happens to you. And if you do not live up to that responsibility, too bad, we can't help you. After all, we are in a competitive situation with other economies, and therefore we cannot spend too much on everyone. We have to limit our interventions, and we see that every day in the current situation. So the situation is less homogeneous than you seem to suggest when you talk about the alliance and the multitude and the 99% and so on. That needs to be supported by empirical analysis of the social structure. That is, and the policies that are adopted by the left of center parties, social democratic, socialist parties that we have today. One debate that does not take place and that needs to be encouraged is whether social protection should apply to the losers or whether it should apply to the potential winners in the social structure. And there is a deep divide within the multitude. Let me, I mean, you need to answer, Albena, you need to answer many questions, and I should not take up too much of your time. Another term that is close to my heart, and actually I have used it since 1972, as someone found out recently and told me. I was not aware that it is that old, but I used it since that time, and the term is decommodification. Decommodification is emancipation of workers in the broadest sense of the need to sell your time to employers. And the key set of policies that are related to this are policies of time. Policies or alleviate the coercive forces within the social structure to sell your time to employers. And these work time policies are, okay, the emancipation means the real option to say no to the need to sell your time. There are strong arguments, as we have seen since the 80s in various countries such as Germany and France, strong arguments that workers do not really want the creation of time, the decommodification, because there are two ways of rewarding productive activities. One is money and one is time. And the fact is that money beats time as a method of rewarding labor or rewarding workers. Why is it so? Many people cannot afford free time because they have to pay all their bills, and you cannot pay bills with time. Another argument is that you cannot save time. 20 minutes today and 20 minutes tomorrow do not make 40 minutes more on the weekend. And that you can do that with money, but you cannot do it with time. And the third argument is that in order to enjoy free time, you need money. And the attractiveness of free time as movement of decommodification is limited. I mean, privileged people such as us can afford to value free time. But many people can't afford free time. Therefore, the does not fall on fertile grounds, to put it lightly. The key question that all these debates, as Leah has also mentioned, lead to is the question of political agency and the question of policies that make sense to people who are suffering from precarity. And we need collective action, forms of collective action. You do not say much about this. We need parties, we need unions, we need movements, whatever. What is the organizational form? What was a Luxembourg question. What is the proper organizational form out of which the desire for change can develop and can grow? And that is a question that cannot be answered by the perspective of multitudes that form alliances. We need also organizational understanding of the forms by which desire for anti-capitalist change can be nurtured and promoted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for these piercing comments and questions to Albaina. Now we'll hear Albaina's response to her critics. Albaina, the floor is yours.
Okay. I am very grateful and very fortunate that 4 of the most brilliant scholars and the scholars that I most value have engaged with my work. Real privilege. But I'm even more grateful that I was just about to lose interest in my book, and your feedback is making me interested again. So that is invaluable. Let me start with clarifying, with addressing a point that Klaus raised. I will not be able to address all of the points, not in a satisfactory manner. I will write, I need time to think, I will write a paper on that by way of response. But let me try to respond to a few of those. About this issue about precarity came up in all of the 4 analysis. Now, I deliberately used the word precarity in order to, in fact, speak about 2 parallel processes that are taking place of precarization. The one is under the neoliberal pressures of global economic competition and slimming down the welfare state. We have generalized social precarity. That is, the society as a whole is becoming more fragile. But then this general social precarity is in turn stratified. So it is experienced in more acute forms by different groups. What I'm trying to say with the book is that it is not sufficient to strengthen individuals and groups through equalization of resources, because even if that fortifies, it diminishes the stratification within precarity, we will not eliminate the other, the social precarity. So I'm not sure how clear that is in the book, but this is a point that I think the left or whatever progressive social forces are out there need not to confuse the 2 things, that it is not sufficient to fight for equality within a precarious society. In fact, this is a point that was made already by John Kenneth Galbraith in '58 in The Affluent Society, that individually wealthy society is not the same as a thriving, socially thriving society. So this probably addresses the question of how we listen to grievances about precariousness. I would listen to them from the point of view of, you know, how they relate to the general condition of social precarity and its drivers. So let me now go back to the specific points. I'm very grateful to you, Amy, for inviting me to clarify my typology of domination. I really like the suggestion, the iteration you give to the links between the three. Indeed, I have not addressed the issue at all about the link between the three types of domination, and actually I have a few PhD students who are taking this up and working on this. One of the reasons that prompted me to distinguish between structural and systemic forms of domination, because initially I was working just with relational and structural, but later I thought it's important to look at all these three things. Now, one of the triggers of this model was the tendency in current day political philosophy to speak of structures as these reified entities with their own power. Iris Young actually speaks about structures as this nebulous and nefarious forces that lurk under the surface of everyday life. So over the past decade, attention to structural factors has been revived. That's great. But scholars have tended to speak of these structures in this as these, you know, hidden forces. That is why I prefer to speak about, to avoid this reification of these entities, of structures. I prefer to speak of institutions, and these are always institutions vested in law, with structuring effect. What that effect is depends not on these institutions themselves, and this is the link is coming up, but on the systemic logic these structures are there to enact, or the institutions are enacting. Whether they're enacting, whether the institution of private property is engaged in the satisfaction of human needs, or is it engaged in the pursuit of profit, this is very important. So when the institution of the private property is used for the pursuit of profit, as it is done under capitalism, then the distributive outcomes, such as inequality and exclusion, they generate domination. Because these institutions affect the distribution of life chances in society, and they trigger differential distribution of social status, for instance. So it is not that any inequality creates domination automatically. I mean, or we cannot say that automatically the rich have more social power. We need to pay attention to by force of what social institutions these inequalities in the distribution of wealth, for instance, play out as social privilege. And then we can identify things like, buying elections, the electoral process in the US as such triggers of the transformation of inequality into social privilege. So this is why I entered the separate category of structural domination. So back to your remark, whether systemic domination is not just a deeper form of structure that undergirds the structural and the relational forms, not in my understanding. it is not just a deeper form. Those structures are there, and their effect depends on what purposes they're deployed for. And the purpose is again, in capitalism, this is the competitive pursuit of profit. In another society, it would be the satisfaction of human needs or whatever we wish it to be. But they are different entities. So, looking at my notes, systemic in capitalism, indeed, systemic domination is a matter of the subjection of all to the imperative of competitive production of profit, whether they profit from that or not. It is instantiated in structures, but is independent. The process is independent of those structures. Thus, we could imagine, in principle, a society where the structure of private property is absent, is eliminated, and even all members are perfectly equal. I lived in a form of that society, and yet that society is engaged in a competitive pursuit of profit, let's say because it is part of the global system of integrated capitalism. So that society needs to compete for jobs and profits with other similar societies. So democratic ownership would not eliminate the process of competitive production, not automatically, of competitive production of profit. To Amy's question, who is subjected to systemic domination, again, anyone who participates in the commodity relation, anyone whose life gains significance by reference to the game of capital accumulation. Amy, you ask, what is it about the competitive production of profit that harms the winners in that game? They have the choice of winning or losing in that game, but they have no choice over their participation in that game. So the harm on the super rich is to live in a precarious society. The environmental degradation is just a component of that precarity, general precarity. The pandemic made it clear that no one is rich enough to secure for themselves a robust healthcare system, because for a good healthcare system, we need enormous investment in science, in education even, that, you know, specific groups of rich people even cannot procure for themselves. So yes, this is their harm of having to live within a generally precarious system. Do I avoid falling into the paradox of emancipation? Maybe I do. When I say tax the rich, I initially criticize that instinct and that glorified move of, you know, tax the rich. It's the celebrity. It's become a celebrity politics, hasn't it? Especially with the attention given to Piketty's work. But it depends what we use the tax for. As long as we use the tax for a return to the growth and redistribution policy logic, which wrecked our societies once, then we are not fighting precarity and we are not solving the environmental problems. We need for that robust social insurance, public services to take care of social precarity. Now, to take care of individual precarity, we need different set of policies, for instance, universal basic income, or as I propose, job sharing, in order to also spread the decommodification capacity of our economies. I propose that we have also universal basic employment, but in terms of, you know, minimal and yet secure employment. Won't it still be the case that the stabilization of production, employment, and income that I contend are necessary conditions for political agency will serve to reinforce capitalism? It sounds like that, right? what I'm saying is that economic stabilization of the particular type I advocate is a necessary but insufficient condition. I'm not saying that the stabilization of the economy would immediately transform society and mobilize the multitude against capitalism. But this economic stabilization or fighting precarity is necessary in order to counter the conservative instincts that precarity triggers. We need to take care of that first, because while the left was hoping that the crisis, the economic crisis, the financial meltdown would radicalize people to the left, actually it's radicalizing them to the right. So we first need to alleviate the economic triggers of these conservative instincts. 1968, but also 89 were good examples of that. The economic stability of these societies. Maybe not so much the affluence, but the stability of these societies was a precondition for dissidents to aspire for an alternative social model. And then only we come with the issue of agency that needs to do the transformative work. Status of utopia. My hesitance about the concept of utopia comes on all the grounds that Amy stipulated. Now, utopia is a useful transformative element in times of crisis to push people in a certain direction. But I start from the historical moment where we find ourselves. I'm trying to present a historicist type of analysis. And what I'm simply saying, if a revolution was in the offing, if capitalism was in a real crisis, and a wonderful utopia was out there, like, I would be the first, to go. However, we inhabit a historical moment in which none of these three things are available. And then I'm asking, so what? Do we have to give up? And I'm saying, well, there are other ways, probably. There is a way around it. So my question is I'm not disparaging utopia, or this is not my issue, or crisis or revolution. I'm only saying, could we do radical social change without them? And then this is a proposal for this. So as I state in my chapter 3, I believe that the new ideological geography of the West, the way the left and the right is actually transformed into two groups that I describe as a risk versus opportunity. Those who see that the global new economy of open borders, technological innovation is rather threatening their lives, and for the others, this is an opportunity, both from decommodification and enrichment. It seems to me that this kind of ideological geography leaves no space for utopia, because it is about how my group is affected by the new economy of open borders. So there is no overarching idea competing for those hearts and minds. The overarching thing that I find is the way generalized social precarity is affecting even the winners, even the opportunity pool. This is the only overarching element that I find between the two warring groups that are in political conflict currently. So this image of open borders, cosmopolitanism, technological advancement, network interconnectedness, are these components of a utopia? No, I think I see them as components of our contemporary technological modernity already, the reality, but attitudes towards them, for many people, this is not something to celebrate, exactly because of the social precarity situation that is triggering negative attitudes towards these things. Maybe the Green New Deal can be such an overarching model to move forward. We'll see. I would welcome it. But I have, as I have advised the European Greens, they should replace their social ideal of social justice that is centered still on growth and redistribution, really to reformulate it in terms of fighting precarity, social precarity, and reducing the inequality within social precarity, but above all, fighting precarity. And now to Paul, who asked how to do empirical research in critical theory, and what are the status of grievances, whose grievances are the valid ones, how to listen to these grievances. Yes, the question for me is indeed how to listen to them. I do welcome your proposal to treat the vernaculars of struggle, the languages of injustice the various groups use, as theoretically productive rather than as social data that we objectify. And you do that very beautifully in your own work. So that is an example of how to do this kind of analysis. But what do we mean when we say, let suffering speak? We should not remain on the surface of stories of victimhood, nor grant validity only to those actors who successfully claim victimhood. Jodi Dean has convincingly argued against this tendency in left scholarship. That is of shrinking the scope of political claims to those of victims needing recognition and redress. This is just not enough. That is why I propose that we take these claims as an entry point for the research of the systemic, and from that, then we start searching for the systemic and structural drivers of injustice. But how to do that, you know, how to move from these entry points of grievances into the structural. Now, in my previous book, in The Scandal of Reason, I studied public deliberations and developed exactly such a methodology. So what I suggested there is that we listen to these aggrieved groups, but not separately, but together, as often the very clash of positions of class enemies, if we want to use that language, leads us to discover the deeper common cause that is at the root of seemingly incompatible grievances. In that old book, I drew on evidence from public deliberations I observed in Hungary. It was about social justice, where a Roma woman got into a vicious verbal fight with a businessman. There were insults exchanged of the sort, the Roma are lazy versus the businessmen are crooks. But gradually, both opponents established that the source of their predicament is the corrupt, inept Hungarian pseudo-democratic state. And that was about 15 years ago. So what would we discover if we analyze together the migrant workers that you study and their purported class enemies? Let's say the typical Trump constituency of low-skilled workers who feel threatened by the migrant workers, or even the IT managers who are losing their minds under the competitive pressures of an industry that innovates in a mad pace. So what I'm suggesting is that we try to link those seemingly incompatible grievances, and what I suppose we'll find as we're looking for the structural sources of those grievances is that the increased competitive pressures of globally integrated capitalism. And I agree with you, empirical work needs to be done on that. I have not done sufficient empirical work. I draw on some studies, but this merits further empirical research. Back to your question, what shall we prioritize in our struggles for justice? The precarity of all versus the acute precarity of some. Again, individual precarity and social precarity are connected. individual precarity is stratified. That is we should fight that stratification, but this is not going to help us get rid of social precarity. This is the point I've been trying to make. And actually, the more precarious societies, social precarity is spread or more severe, the more visible individual precaritization becomes, because each relies more on individual resources to cope. See? So, in fact, we are more pushed to lobby for individual empowerment through redistribution, the deeper social precarity is. So our worries about inequality is actually a symptom how deeply precarious our societies have become, because of the social precarity, lower incomes become a real social evil or social injustice. So I treat that indeed as a symptom, that obsession, I would say obsession with inequality. I mean, even Marx did not advocate for material equality in communism. Remember there the rule was to everybody according to their needs, which is not the same as equality. Okay. On the issue you raised about class struggle, more often than not, societies have achieved lasting radical shifts only where the broad alliance of social forces have pushed in the same direction. Take the origin of the welfare state, take the civil rights movement, always the social forces beyond the particular aggrieved groups, or even the shift to the neoliberal project of the 1980s. It was a love child of the center left and the center right. So the logic of counter-hegemonic coalitions is usually stronger than that, or the logic of a passive revolution through a broad counter-hegemonic coalition tends to be stronger, more successful than the class struggle. This is not a historical law, a historical rule, but I find that in our particular historical moment, we have the opportunity to tap into this general discontent with capitalism. Social surveys are showing a large discontent with capitalism across the class divide. Things, I cannot quote them right now, but they appeared and attracted much attention just before the pandemic, these kind of surveys. Okay, so I'm afraid my fear is that reviving the class struggle discourse will only impede the formation of the counter-hegemonic movement against capitalism in our particular moment. However, I like your proposal to redefine class, and I would redefine it away from a relation to the means of production, but rather I would seek to redefine it in relation to how much or to what way people are exposed to the competitive production of profit, actually to the three elements of that phrase, to competition, to the productivist nature of work, and to the pursuit of profit. So that would be an interesting thing to do, probably, to redefine the class struggle according to, in that direction. Okay. Leah, right, again, I would celebrate crisis, revolution, and utopia. And the point of this book is to say, if they're not available, let's still do it. I love the, where's my, oh, here's the sheet. Yes, I would go along Rosa Luxemburg's notion of revolution and the idea of entrenching in law certain radical steps. I reason along the notion of a radical change rather than revolutionary change. So radical steps can be very mundane, in fact, politically. Things. It is, for instance, very radical and very surprising what the European Commission, now dominated by the center right, it is dominated by the liberals and the conservatives. It is coming up with this project for European Green Deal. Well, in itself is rather radical. It's maybe not revolutionary in the common, in the everyday understanding of a revolutionary rupture, but it is being enshrined in law. And in that sense, is exactly following the Rosa Luxemburg's understanding of revolution as a radical policy entrenched in law. I would certainly align with that logic of reasoning. What is my normative? I'm not a normative philosopher. I hate being asked this. It is lurking there, I know. I need to think about that. I just don't want to commit to anything tonight. Let me think and I'll write back to you. Sufficitarian criterion of justice, I seem to be endorsing. Absolute versus relational issues of deprivation, I need to think more about that. So the most difficult issue about whether with what I define as radical policies, and radical policy I define according to anything that impedes or counters the logic of the competitive production of profit, if it is the most mundane, humble policy steps, for me it's radical, because it strikes at the very constitutive logic of capitalism. So whether it would tame capitalism or entrench it further or overthrow it, well, to the extent that anything that goes against the very constitutive logic of capitalism in my conceptualization is radical. So it would not entrench capitalism, but it would not overthrow it automatically. I'm saying that we need first to create the social conditions of agency and then to start organizing. Because without those social conditions of agency, and those would be fighting precarity, stabilization, the multitude would be driven by its conservative and even reactionary instinct to stabilize itself, to dig its heels, historically speaking. Okay, let me stop here, and I promise to think more about this and write and send you my written replies. Again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Albina, for your response. I will open the floor now for questions to the panelists, any of them. I will collect the questions in sets of 3. I already have David Owen and James Galbraith. So Gilel is coming next, so we'll start the round. No?
There's a hand raised. Okay.
So who else wanna be part of this round of questions?
Let's start with 2.
Okay, then we start. Let's start with David Owen. Please, David.
David.
Very much, and thanks Albina and everyone. I very much enjoyed this evening, as well as reading the book. So I've got sort of two things I want to ask. One, because it's a genuine kind of perplexity for me, which is, I think, Albena, you do a great job of showing that the issue of insecurity and precarity is distinct to the issue of inequality. That, as it were, it's not reducible to issues of inequality. And I think that's important. What I'm not sure about is how you theorize the relationship between them. So, for example, precarity didn't come from nowhere. It came from conditions under which inequality had increased, unions had been shattered, you know, and so the decline of equality, I mean, you know, European and American societies were at their most equal in income terms in the late 70s, mid-late 70s, and then went down, and then the, you know, Big Bang in 1984 massively accelerated increases in rates of inequality. So it looks like inequality is part of the story about how we get precarity. But there's also a kind of question, which I could kind of put hyperbolically. We can solve the problem of precarity if we don't care that much about inequality. We just have a neo-feudal state that doesn't pursue the profit motive. Everybody has a secure job for life in their place. All serfs know where they should be. Okay, and that suggests to me, since you obviously wouldn't like that, that equality must be part of your story as well. But what kind of equality and how you think the relation of precarity and equality is not clear to me. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second is a completely different issue. I mean, you have mentioned a couple of times, and you do say in the book a couple of times, you know, talk about this sort of open borders thing. We don't live in a world of open borders. We live in a world of highly stratified mobility across different countries, across different classes, across different racial groups. And part of what you might call the transnational class structure is precisely regulated by people's access to the ability to move. Okay? Now, you operate here, even though when you're talking about globalization, all your policy and frame and everything is a national state frame. Okay? But actually the problems here are transnational, you know, and the sort of good old socialist tradition of internationalism, it seems to me, might want to be playing some part or some bigger part in this story, because, you know, domination in terms of mobility is a big part of the contemporary political economy of the world. Okay, so that's second. That's it.
Thank you, David. We'll take the question of James Galbraith now. Please, James.
Thank you very much. I already expressed my view of Albena's book in an early review, perhaps the first. I thought it deserved unqualified praise, and so that's what I gave it. What I want to offer now is a more general comment directed perhaps at the whole panel and anybody who might care to respond. Albena's book is entitled Capitalism on Edge, and I thought that was a very apt title at the time, but that was then, and this is now. If you ask me what my definition of capitalism is, and I think we need to think about this in quite precise terms, as an economist, I would say it was the merger of double entry bookkeeping and the expansion of financial credit. And if you ask me what my view of domination is, I would say it's the relationship between the creditor and the debtor, between the person who extends the loan and the person who has to pay it back. And all of that, to be successful, depends upon there being in the system a general aspect of positive net equity. There has to be some base on which capitalism operates. That's the way and when there isn't, it's a genuine crisis. We've had crises in the past, but we haven't had a crisis that was remotely as big, certainly not in our lives, as one we've just seen in the last 3 months. And what we've seen as a result of that, generally speaking, is a vast expansion of the fixed costs facing capitalism in general relative to the revenues that are coming in. You can see this in absolutely everything, from the from the airline sector to the restaurant sector, anything you look at, this is the case. And it's all going to show up in a massive inability to cover the debt that are built into the fixed costs, which are contracts that on which the financial system depends.
James, I believe you're done with your question, right?
He froze. He froze.
He froze. Okay. Okay, we'll take then the next question, the third question. William Callison, please go.
So I'm going to be, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to be super brief. There are a couple things that I'd like to push on with a little bit more time, including the definition of radical that you just offered. But really briefly, just one thing that surprised me, and that seems like it might be somewhat important for thinking about your book in the present, is this absence of crisis. So you say, you say, in the absence of crisis, revolution, utopia, none of those things holding, I'm offering an account. But it does seem to be the case that we're now in a crisis, and that a crisis is on the near horizon. You said all of those things are absent currently. I know you've been thinking a lot about this recently, which is why I ask why you're saying crisis is absent. So my two questions are, why are you suggesting that crisis is absent at present or in the near future? And then the more kind of broader conceptual question perhaps for your book is, in the presence of crisis, how does this impact your account? Certain aspects of your argument maybe fall away or change in the presence of crisis.
All right, shall I answer those?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Let's start with the last one, how the pandemic actually changed my account. So now crisis destabilizes further. So economic crisis destabilizes further. Our precarity has been radicalized, and that naturally makes people, in fact, more conservative. So there is a stronger desire to go back to the previous condition, which is being romanticized as a very good state to go back to. So unfortunately, we had this crisis. I don't think that it is helping capitalism to go, towards its end. Now, in a condition of crisis, if we had a plausible, appealing utopia, it would have helped. But unfortunately, except among the very the young adults in Europe and America, socialism and people like us, some sort of that are embracing some sort of a liberal socialism, it is not a very popular ideal. So that would have helped, but I don't think it's available. So in fact, the way the pandemic is changing, my analysis is to say, unfortunately, we have an economic crisis which is in the way of the mobilization of anti-capitalist counterwave. That's my reading of it. There are opportunities, yeah, but we need to, for instance, there are opportunities. See, even the government of Macron, who is hardly a radical thinker, has said green strings attached to helping companies. Air France will not compete with railways, stop those lines that compete with railways. So there are opportunities in this, but whether the social forces would be able to join forces in one direction, yeah, we remains to be seen. Social pressure in that way is very important now, and it's happening. The social pressure is there. But yes, so my analysis is becoming. I think it's still there generally, but the situation is darker and less likely to change because we are romanticizing, we are idealizing the pre-pandemic situation, which was really not so good. David's perplexity about the way inequality and precarity are connected. Actually, inequality and precarity are, if we're thinking in terms of wealth and jobs, you know, tax the rich, redistribute that, or build social services with this. You know, the difficulties is that the process of wealth creation is a process. It is not an entity that is, it's about how to distribute it fairly, right? It's very easy to think about wealth statically in terms of something that is out there and needs to be distributed fairly. That would not be a problem. The problem is that the process of wealth creation is a complicated thing. And in a capitalist society where that wealth is created through, you know, many ways, but a lot of that is through private initiative that is motivated exclusively through the pursuit of profit. You need to be consistent logically. Either you accept that and then you kind of nurture it, or you think, let's think about redistribution. There is something wrong with the creation of wealth in this way. And if and then put in public hands the entities who are in fact enriching themselves through rent extraction. So it wouldn't be enough to tax them. We just need to nationalize such entities. So okay. So yeah, I still need to think and write that book or write paper about the link between inequality and precarity. But what I want to say is that once we start thinking them as a process rather than as an entity to be distributed, we understand that it is not an easy zero-sum game. Well, the issue of open borders that you raised, well, I think that in fact, my analysis is positioned within globally integrated capitalism, and I'm saying that in fact the global production chains and value networks are that context that creates those competitive pressures that are wrecking, that are generating precarity, and it is generating those pressures are generating precarity, both individual precarity because our jobs are becoming less secure, and social precarity because the you know, the public sector, public services, industries are being slaughtered. So in fact, the global context is generating those policies that are creating the two types of precarity that we're talking about. Jamie, I don't know.
Albena, maybe before you answered James, we let him complete his
yes,
question because he's back now.
I didn't get a question.
Yeah, the end of your question now. Now you have, unfortunately, James, to articulate it again in a post-crisis mode.
I guess my question is whether you might be inclined to agree.
Can you raise the level of the mic?
We cannot hear you.
Yeah, my question is that better?
Not really. If you can still.
It is better, no? Yeah, it is better. I can hear it better.
All right. I don't know. Let's see. that should be, if that's any better, I don't know.
Yeah.
I will try to speak clearly. Okay. So my question, and really is directed to anybody who would care to respond, is whether we, I thought one of the great merits of Albena's book was it set the stage for viewing where we are now, but that we may well be, have reached a different stage at this particular moment, in which we're not going back to some of the situation that existed 6 months ago, and we need to think in terms of how to deal with the issue that Albena frames, which is a massive precarity of the present situation, in the context of a generalized, effectively a collapse. And one of the things one has to notice is that is affecting the West, where this model of basically a net equity-based system is prevalent. It's not affecting China. It's not affecting other systems where where essentially enterprise and employment are being treated as going concerns at the level of the entity that can deal with them.
Right.
So I'm wondering whether this is really something that I'm alone in thinking to be the case, or whether others share that at least the possibility that this is the situation.
I don't know how to answer that. Maybe if somebody else, I need to think. Klaus, maybe?
No.
Leah?
I mean, a lot would be, in fact, yeah, whether we go in a radical direction would depend on what we do with debts. No, I wouldn't dare to answer that now. But I did not answer William Callison's question about, sorry, I don't want to preempt. Is there somebody in the room who want to address James Galbraith's concern before I go back to answering?
I can say something quickly, just not so much, I don't know that I have any forward-looking views, but there is a historical precedent in the age of the rise of imperialism, right? When there is this massive financial crisis, where there's a massive crisis in the credit crisis, which leads to imperialist expansion and war. So I don't want to be pessimistic.
Ouch.
But it seems to me that there are historical analogs to this situation for the West, right?
James, you want to react to that?
There are definitely analogs, but if you go back, I think, to think about them, there were periods when the West had a far greater advantage in those respects than it does now. It basically has none, and therefore does not have, it may try, no question. You can look at the attitude of the present U.S. administration for evidence that it would like to try, but that it has any prospect of success, I would say, is essentially zero. This is not the 18th century or the 19th century. Not going to work. And I can assure you the U.S. military understands this, because I've actually had a chance to speak to them on the subject just after the invasion of Iraq, and they knew how desperate it was.
And it's interesting what they say actually about it. What is their vision? If imperialist expansion is not in the cards, to paraphrase Albena. So,
what the vision at the highest levels of the U.S. government is delusional. It's that everything is going to come back to normal in a few months, and we'll have a massively high rate of growth, and that they can do this by pumping money into the system. And this is a shared vision of the Republicans and the Democrats, frankly. And they have not adjusted to, I think, the underlying reality, which is this is not just a financial crisis. There's an underlying shift. But just to give you one example, I'm sitting in the middle of one of the largest oil booms in modern times, and at least a few hundred miles from where I sit. It's over. it's done. And that is the entire energy basis of the United States recovery in the last 12 years. Is finished. Cannot be sustained at the current prices. So, I mean, it is simply unrealistic to think that the system is going to go on or recover to where it was 6 months ago.
If I may say something with regards to that, is that Albina very briefly in the appendix of the book talks about other constitutive operative logic of capitalism. She terms it primitive appropriation, which is, after Marx, I believe, ursprüngliche Akkumulation. And it seems that probably the key to understanding the capitalist crisis or to overcome it might come also from that direction, because there are no vistas anymore in the imperialist, world or within empires for this highly extractivist, in the economic sense, policies to pursue over the world. We've stretched too thin, I believe. Imperialists have, discovered almost everything, unless they want to degrade people from all the things they identify with, and then it becomes blatant racism. Then, environmental threats and racism are analogical. So, but yeah, it's another constitutive dynamic of capitalism, which is, I believe, is very crucial to understanding the situation of the U.S.
I think that's the predatory. The word predation is very much the right word for this, whether it's internal or external, the two types.
Yeah, but once, there were things to predate on from which you could extract surplus, from which you could make competitive production of profit. Nowadays, it's less and less, viable. They are less in the cards.
Exactly. The leverage is very, very high.
I believe the other dynamic, which Albina hasn't highlighted, but which is crucial to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. So we shift from the pursuit of profit to appropriation, primitive appropriation. Right.
Marx would put it. Okay.
William Callison asked me how I understand radical, and radical for me is anything that strikes at the two constitutive logics, not so much the institutional structures, but the constitutive logic of primitive appropriation, I call it, and the competitive production of profit. So anything that is against that for me is radical. That's my answer.
Well, Will, you have something to say about that, about her answer?
Well, part of why I asked it, I'm interested in thinking about the concept of radical more broadly if we had more time. But the reason I raised it in this case was because the Green Deal you mentioned the European Commission. This has been a subject of critique from the left for just how underwhelming it is. The fact that they struck the word "new" from the deal in order to almost under-promise from the start.
Right.
And the question, I think, especially from a Marxist point of view, when you use the word radical, is whether it transforms any kind of more beyond green, so beyond the energy sector, certain structural features of the system. And my understanding of the deal is that it doesn't, in fact, do that. And that's why I wanted to raise the question of whether radical would be proper here, and whether that deal does enough to kind of move us in the direction of overcoming capitalism in the spirit of what your argument is, as I understand it in the book.
Yeah, well, to be radical, you have to transform the nature of social relations, and society which is not committed to the competitive pursuit of profit would not be capitalist. So we need to see whether these policies that are in the European Green Deal package, how they relate to the competitive production of profit. Now the Commission is talking about renegotiating trade deals in order to put higher social and environmental standards. So any trade with the European Union would have along different standards, and those standards cannot be achieved if we succumb to the logic fully of competitive production of profit. So in that sense, they would be radical if it is executed in that way. Of course, some say that it is greenwashing. You cannot achieve this just simply relying on green technology. You really have to go against growth. You have to go against growth based on the pursuit of profit. So whether they will, in fact, go in that direction far enough, we have to see. But the promises have been made to happen. And mind you, not in a very democratic way, because none of that has been put to public consultation.
And a place to look moving forward to see how badly this promise has failed, perhaps, is the Mercosur deal, where sure, Macron added a clause about not further damaging the Amazon rainforest when when a new trade deal commences with South America, but that one qualification was basically all of the concession that they could get with respect to the green aspects of the deal.
That's right. Yeah.
More questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, please, Noel.
So, yay, thank you for a lovely session, wonderful panelists, great response. So I'm going to come out of left field here, going back to the first generation of critical theory, which was faced with crisis galore that did not lead to revolution. And I mean, that's a really, I think, a point that's underlying here that, as Albena said, it's not just that she's looking for a theory that can work absent crisis, but even in crisis, that just leads to kind of reactionary politics. I mean, we are seeing the kind of conspiracy-minded, reactionary, I mean, there is something at work here. So this is really a big question. There's no way to answer it, but I have to put it on the table. You know, we've been waiting around for the crises of late capitalism to finally be crisis enough so that, whoa, we're going to look for the alternative. But the more crises there are, we have more and more reaction formation. So my critical theory work is coming out of psychoanalysis, because we have to understand what is when there is crisis, actually, people become more reactionary. Right. I don't know if you have anything to say to that, but I just want to sort of come in behind you that we need a theory that can work without crisis, but also I think we actually need to think about when there is crisis and what is going on that leads to this kind of reactionary, paranoid, right-wing politics that makes it worse. I think that's a question not just for about your book, but about a kind of underlying logic of the left tradition, waiting for crisis to be bad enough. I think it's really a dead end. It's really dangerous. It's not productive. It's, oh, good, it's so bad now, things will be better. I've been waiting around for that for 30 years and I'm kind of done with it. That's all. But anyway, this was a lovely session. That's more, I guess, a comment if you want to pick up on it, but thank you.
Well, this is what I say in the book, that crisis is radicalizing people in the wrong direction, indeed. I do not elaborate on this, not on the social psychology of that, but I note this is my starting position. Yeah, I work with a concept of crisis of crisis, or I recently called that a meta-crisis, because in physics there is this notion of metastable state where an entity doesn't have enough energy to exit from its condition, but it is too weak to do anything. So we seem to be stuck in this meta-crisis. that because it's no longer a crisis if we are for a long time in this situation. It is a certain kind of a new entity that needs to be studied and analyzed indeed. Yeah.
Thank you, Albena. Thank you, Noel. Paul has something to say on that. So to you, Noel, and to Albena. So please, Paul.
Yeah, I would just caution against too quickly and too unequivocally saying that the crisis is only turning people in a conservative direction politically. I mean, the fact is that there's a lot of labor organizing going on right now in the United States. So, for example, in Central Washington State, what's been going on has re-radicalized Apple industry warehouse workers who had major labor actions about 15, 20 years ago and have walked off the job now. There have been walkouts from Amazon warehouses that have been highly publicized. The groups that I studied, day labor organizations, have been using this as an opportunity to develop a whole new curriculum of popular education. And I think it's really interesting that the way that they've picked up on this notion of essential workers and tilted in the direction of essential working class there. So I do think there's complexity out there. I agree. Obviously, there is going to be aspects of just plain fear that make people want to romanticize what existed beforehand. I think you're right about that, Albena, to a degree. But there's other other forces that work.
Good.
But the other thing though is that sure, there will be uneven developments, but the idea that a crisis would sort of transform the hearts and minds and create a new kind of cultural hegemony, I think that's a dead end, right? But I hear you entirely. I think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the crisis doesn't do it on its own.
No, we seem to agree on that, right?
Any more remarks, questions, comments?
No.
Okay, my dears.
We seem to be coming to an end.
2 hours and 15 minutes of sustained discussion, engagements, interventions. What have we? Lots of things, lots of fun points. Thank you very, very much for attending. That was lovely. And I hope to see you next year in Prague or elsewhere. Thank you, Albena. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Leah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Azar, for making this happen.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, all.
Really great to see everybody. And yeah, we remain in touch, and I promise to answer more seriously, comprehensively the questions upon due reflection.
And many thanks to all also people who post questions and comments and rich discussion. Thanks a lot. Have a good night, all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Take care.
So we don't have to, I don't know, I'm not going to end the session. Yeah, let's just chat. Come on.
No one is hanging out at the bar.
Sorry?
No one is hanging out at the bar.
Leah, where are you actually physically?
I'm in Berlin.
You're in Berlin, right? Yeah. You got stuck there, but it's not a bad place to be stuck.
No, it's fine. It's actually really, really good here.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Where are you? Are you in Brussels?
I'm in Brussels.
You are at the Wissenschaft colleagues, right?
No, I'm at the IBZ. I'm at the Free University actually. This year I was doing, I was on a Humboldt fellowship. So at the FO. I loved your book though, Albena. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I know I have critical comments, but it made me think a lot. And
this is how it's done. So
I liked it. It was really great. It was really, what I really like about it is that it's so kind of comprehensive, and it manages to bring, I don't know how you do it actually, to bring together all these different literatures, and it's crazy.
Yeah, I read everything, and there are all these loose ends that came together. It was great when everything just fit together at some point. Now that I talk to people, it's falling apart. But at one point it made total sense to me, and it was a wonderful moment.
Yeah, no, it was really nice to read. Actually, you could see it was all coming together. Also,
Yeah.
also the other thing that I really love about it is this kind of taking the Frankfurt School back to its political economy roots, which no one has done so far.
Look, they knew
amazing.
that it's important to do political economy, but they were not equipped to do it.
Yeah. No.
So okay, but we can try to do it. I'm not an economist.
Yeah,
I'm a political theorist. It's hard. That's why I've been reading so much.
Yeah.
We just need to, as once Sheila remarked, we just need to join forces.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, that's really amazing. I love that.
One person cannot do it all.
Yeah, exactly.
All of these questions that were asked to me tonight, I hope that other people pick them up.
Yeah, definitely. No, definitely. I think that was really great. That was one of the things that I loved about the book, is how it was taking like all this kind of critical theory tradition back to its Marxist roots. And because I think some people like, Nancy has done a little bit of that, but I don't think it was as sharp and engaged with the kind of political economy as you, and with also this coming together of political science and the political economy. So